Hezbollah's leader says Lebanon's mass protest movement will lead the country to civil war. It comes after his supporters faced off with protesters in Beirut. A fresh wave of anger against the government sweeps Iraq. At least 40 people have been killed in renewed nationwide protests. And violence erupts in Chile once again as protesters clash with security forces. Earlier, 1 million people marched onto the capital, Santiago, in the largest protest in a week of deadly demonstrations. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Julia Kim. First, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah has urged his supporters to shun Lebanon's mass protest movement. He said it threatened to drag the country into a civil war. The last 9 days has produced some of the biggest rallies in nearly 15 years. Protesters have united across sectarian divides to call for a complete political overhaul. But cracks are now starting to show. Earlier, Hezbollah supporters scuffled with protesters in Beirut. Well, let's go there now to talk to France 24's Leila Molana Allen. Leila, how have people there reacted to Hassan Nasrallah's speech yesterday?
Well, people have reacted to the speech much as they have reacted to the other politicians' speeches. It's important to point out that usually Nasrallah's speeches are not really for the mass of Lebanon, although lots of people listen to them. They are, of course, mainly for his supporters and for the Shia heartland. But everyone, of course, listening to the speech yesterday, given what's going on right now. And really, people said he is much the same as all the others, which is unusual for Nasrallah. He was firstly saying, that the most important thing is for dialogue and that the protesters should see what they've achieved so far as successes, the reforms that they have convinced Prime Minister Hariri to impose. Protesters don't see it like that at all. They see the reforms as economic factors which really aren't going to affect their daily lives, and that's not what they're asking for. They're asking for a complete change to the social order. And Nasrallah then took really the scare tactic route. He started saying that civil war was on the way back. He even said, I have seen checkpoints where people are setting up arbitrary checkpoints and checking IDs. What does that remind you of? Now, that, of course, is something that happened throughout the civil war here in Lebanon, where at arbitrary checkpoints, militiamen would kill other people, other Lebanese people, based on their religious sect. Now, as far as we have heard, there are no reports of this actually happening in Lebanon at the moment. He also said salaries will fall, you will lose your jobs. And he also then went so far as to say that the protesters were being funded by foreign governments and demanded that they admit who they were being funded by. So as far as the protests are concerned, these are all scare tactics. Nasrallah, just like the other leaders, is trying to stop them being out on the streets. And what's interesting here is that, of course, Nasrallah's die-hard Hezbollah supporters are still supporting him. And afterwards, and even before the speech, in fact, there were scuffles all over Beirut and outside Beirut, as there were clashes between protesters and these Hezbollah supporters saying you are disrespecting Hassan Nasrallah by calling for him not to be in government anymore. He, of course, himself isn't, but his delegates are in the government currently. But the interesting case is the people who come from the Shia heartlands, who are Hezbollah supporters, theoretically, but have started to say, actually, we see Nasrallah as just like the other politicians and we don't support him anymore.
And now what is at stake then for Hezbollah here as this protest movement continues?
Hezbollah is in a very difficult situation. Hezbollah, of course, started as a resistance movement. It started as a resistance movement for the disenfranchised Shia in Lebanon to rise up and take back what was theirs, and then increasingly as a resistance movement against Israel to the south on that southern border where Hezbollah is very strong in that area. And so in a lot of ways, Nasrallah has always shown himself to be, or portrayed himself as, the man of the people. He is not like these other elite politicians. He is there. He understands the common man. He doesn't believe in the elite societal differences between rich and poor in Lebanon. But right now, Hezbollah is more powerful politically than they have ever been in Lebanon because they did so well in the last in the last election. And so they hold a lot of power in this government. They're in cabinet and they don't want to lose that. So Nasrallah finds himself in this very difficult position where normally he would be supporting people out on the streets. He's supporting an uprising against the elites, but at the moment he is one of the elites. So he tried to clarify that in his speech yesterday, because last week when he made a speech, people felt this is very bizarre that he's supporting the government. Yesterday he said, Hezbollah supporters are not out in the streets opposing the protests, but if we were, we would never be doing it in favour of the government. We would only be rising up with the people against the government. But right now we're not doing that because it is too dangerous. With the economic situation, we cannot afford for the government to fall right now and us to have to form a new one. It will destroy Lebanon. There will be chaos and everything will collapse. Now, people weren't really buying that argument. Certainly the sort of more mainstream protesters who aren't traditional Hezbollah supporters, but he does seem to have shifted his position. So right now, what Nasrallah has to decide is whether he is going to continue putting his weight behind this government. Yesterday, he was supporting both Prime Minister Hariri and President Aoun, which is, as I say, is unusual for him, or whether he's going to decide to cut his losses and sort of back this protest movement. That seems unlikely because, as I say, yesterday we had these clashes with Hezbollah supporters coming out on the streets, and Nasrallah actually said to his supporters, please don't do this, please don't stop the protesters protesting, it is their right. And eventually, after many of them refused to leave the protest sites, he actually sent his officials out to go and fetch them. And in downtown Beirut, where I was, an official came into the square to try and remove these Hezbollah protesters causing trouble. And another protester shouted "Killon Yani Killon," which means all of them means all of them. That's the chant about getting rid of all the politicians, including Nasrallah and Hezbollah. And this official slapped the protester. So feeling so strong here that even though his job was to diffuse the tensions, he actually got involved too.
Well, Leila Malana Allen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for that update. Leila Malana Allen there reporting to us from Beirut. Well, anti-government sentiment has also sparked mass demonstrations in Iraq. At least 40 people were killed in nationwide protests. Demonstrators say their demands can be summed up in 4 words: jobs, water, electricity, and safety. This comes after a series of clashes 2 weeks ago, which left 157 people dead. A curfew has been declared in some southern cities. Well, France 24's Baghdad correspondent Zamina Fulton brings you up to date.
Despite widespread calls for restraint, Friday became the bloodiest day yet since the beginning of the demonstrations in early October. Some of the protesters were killed when they received a hit by a tear gas canister to their heads, but most of the fatalities seem to have occurred when demonstrators attempted to storm the offices of certain parties in Iraq's southern provinces, including the offices of Asaib al-Haq, an Iranian-backed armed group that is at least officially integrated into the popular mobilization forces. And this is quite remarkable because it appears that demonstrators have lost any kind of fear, and there is growing concern that these demonstrations may turn into sustained confrontation in Iraq's Shiite south between groups that are loyal to Iran and other groups that oppose Iranian intervention. And that could be a fresh source of instability in this country. For now, it remains to be seen whether Friday's demonstrations and violence will spill into a second day, and we will be watching the situation closely.
Well, as night fell on Chile, protests have turned violent. Police fired tear gas and deployed water cannons to disperse demonstrators. One water cannon truck was hit by a petrol bomb. It comes after an estimated 1 million people marched peacefully earlier in the day, calling for reforms and the president's resignation. It's the biggest rally since deadly violence broke out a week ago. Well, for more, let's now talk to Latin America analyst Colin Harding. Colin, thanks very much for being with us today. First of all, it started out as a protest over the hike in metro fares. How did it evolve into the violence that we're seeing today?
Well, I think a lot of people have joined in with the general sentiment that the system isn't working anymore, neither the economic system nor the political system, or it's not working for them, not for most people. And this seems to go across social classes. There is a very widespread feeling that inequality has gone too far, that the liberal economic model that Chile has been following since the military regime of the 1980s, which delivered impressive economic growth and good social development in some areas, but it's led to excessive inequality, and most people are feeling the pinch. Even people who've escaped from poverty are struggling to make ends meet and to get by. So this march which the official estimate is 1.2 million people took part in Santiago alone, expresses what the governor of the Santiago region describes as the dream of a new Chile, and the hope that reforms can be introduced to spread the benefits of economic growth more widely and ensure that the political system becomes more responsive to people's perceived needs.
And how has the government been responding to these protests? Because there had been criticism that the president had been too slow in reacting.
Well, the president's initial reaction was we're at war against a ruthless enemy that will stop at nothing to destroy our system. He's changed his tune radically yesterday. He welcomed the march as expressing this dream, and he's clearly trying to climb on board the reform bandwagon and put himself at the head of it. And there have been, as has been reported, calls for his resignation, which is not going to happen. And the president is hoping that with his change of tune, that he will get across to people that he understands their concerns, that he's heard the message, and that he and his government are going to take their concerns seriously, and they're going to initiate a process of reform with, he hopes, Sebastián Piñera, the president, hopes he'll be at the head of it. It remains to be seen if the political system can cope, but that is, it does represent a very sharp change in the attitude of the government. Although of course, there's still a state of emergency, there are still troops on the streets, and that will continue as long as there are clashes of the sort we saw last night. But the government itself is emphasizing that this is a peaceful, joyful movement, and that the government wants to respond to the demands of the people.
And what kind of impact have these protests had on the country? Because it's caused a lot of damage, for example.
Well, of course, yes, and it's not exactly done the country's image a great deal of good either. There have been lots of material damage in Santiago, particularly to the metro system, which is rather a good one, but very expensive. And of course, the wrecking of pay kiosks and the turnstiles we have to go through to get into it represents people's fury at the proposed increase, which was the final straw for a lot of people. You know, they spend a lot of their income on transport in a large sprawling city, and to have a fare increase was the last thing they could cope with. So there had been a wreckage of things like the metro, public buildings that have been smashed windows and so on. The government is hoping that this can now be controlled. That's why they put the army on the streets, for instance, and 20,000 odd and police as well. And that this can now be controlled. I mean, I think the president emphasizing that this is a peaceful movement, that he understands people's concerns, that he's going to take them into account. It is the hope that the violence we have seen at times can now be controlled, and the country can remain united. He's calling for unity, and I think a lot of people hope that will be possible.
Okay, Colin Harding, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for that analysis. Now, the Democrats' bid to impeach President Trump has been given a boost by a U.S. court. A judge has granted a request by the House Judiciary Committee for access to redacted material from the Mueller report. Democrats believe that there may be information in there that incriminates Trump. The Justice Department has an October 30th deadline to hand over the information. Jean-Emile Jamin tells us more.
A day when impeachment once again took center stage. The Justice Department was ordered to hand over Special Counsel Robert Mueller's full testimony, a district court deeming the material of the report of greater need than its continued secrecy, something U.S. President Donald Trump resents.
And you know who's angry about it? The Republican Party is angry about it, because this isn't a takedown of the president. This is a takedown of the Republican Party. And frankly, the Democrats should be ashamed of themselves.
Despite finding insufficient evidence to implicate Trump, Mueller's investigation into possible Russian collusion during the 2016 elections has been a constant thorn in the side of the presidency. Many parts of the released report were blacked out, however, leading to speculation that not all facts were on the table. Friday's ruling is said to be seen as a major victory for House Democrats, but this was not their last play of the day. 3 more subpoenas were later issued to top White House officials in connection with Trump's request for Ukraine to investigate domestic political rival Joe Biden. The impeachment inquiry could lead to the House passing formal charges, prompting a trial in the Republican-controlled Senate.
Thanks for watching. There's more news coming up next.